The most dangerous thing ever done to me wasn't done by a stranger. It was done quietly, with a pen and a forged signature, while I was working a Saturday shift and had no idea that someone was trying to sign away everything I had spent 8 years building on my own. Before I get into what happened, do me a favor, hit the like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious to see how far this story travels. I want to start with what that land actually meant to me, because I think the context matters. I grew up in a family that talked a lot about sacrifice and not a lot about actual support. When I decided at 24 that I was going to save enough money to buy a property of my own one day, I understood from the beginning that no one was going to help me get there. That was fine. I had accepted it. I was working full-time as an occupational therapist at a rehabilitation clinic in Barrie, Ontario, and I was willing to do whatever it took to get to where I wanted to go. I picked up every Saturday shift the clinic posted. I took on evening home visits that other staff turned down because the drives were too long or the hours too inconvenient. I moved into a basement apartment in a neighborhood I didn't love just to keep my rent low enough to save a real amount each month. For 5 years I drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked dashboard and a heating system that stopped working reliably every February. I said no to weekend trips. I skipped birthday dinners I genuinely wanted to attend because I had done the math and didn't have room in the budget. Some months I had less than $200 of discretionary income. I kept reminding myself that the discomfort was temporary and what I was working toward was not. By the time I was 32, I had saved $91,000, enough for a solid down payment on a rural property in the Haliburton Highlands, a few hours northeast of Toronto, in the heart of Ontario cottage country. 15 acres of mixed forest and open land, a modest 2-bedroom house, and a working sugar bush of close to 600 mature maple trees that the previous owner had tapped for years. I walked into my credit union branch alone, signed every document myself, and left with the keys. Nobody co-signed. Nobody contributed $1. The mortgage was in my name from the first day, and I had always understood that to me the responsibility was mine, and the ownership was mine, equally and completely. Within 2 years I had expanded the maple operation significantly. I put in a proper evaporator shed, upgraded the tubing system through the sugar bush, and started selling at 3 different farmers markets in the region. A handful of restaurants in Haliburton and Minden began carrying my syrup under a small label I designed myself. I also renovated an old outbuilding into a 1-room guest house and listed it on a short-term rental platform. Between the syrup revenue and the rental bookings, the property was starting to generate enough income to meaningfully offset the mortgage, and I was genuinely proud of what I had managed to create out of years of patience and discipline. The property taxes were assessed to my name. The mortgage statements came to my address. The deed at the land registry listed a single owner. There was no partnership with any family member, no verbal agreement, no shared understanding that I owed anyone a piece of what I had built. That single legal fact should have made everything that followed impossible. Instead, it became the reason my family decided I was a reasonable target. The phone rang at 20 minutes past 11 on a Thursday night in late September. I was already in bed. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code was Toronto, and something about the hour made me pick up rather than let it go to voicemail. "Is this Sienna?" Calm, businesslike, unhurried. I confirmed my name and asked who was calling. He introduced himself as Preston Mercer. He said he operated a private lending firm that worked with clients in and around the Greater Toronto area, and that he had been trying to reach my brother for several weeks without success. "Why are you calling me about my brother?" I asked. "Because your brother listed your property in Haliburton County as collateral against a loan of $68,000, he said. "The loan is significantly past due, and he has not been responding to our contact attempts." I actually laughed when he said it, not because anything was funny, but because the sentence didn't immediately register as real. "My property? He doesn't own my property. The documentation we hold suggests otherwise," Mercer said. "We have a signed power of attorney granting him authority over the asset, along with a registered land transfer confirming a 50% ownership interest." I got out of bed and turned on the light. "There is no power of attorney. I never signed anything like that in my life. You have the wrong information." He didn't argue. He simply said that from his firm's perspective, the documentation was valid, and that I had 30 days before collection proceedings would begin against the collateral. Then, he ended the call. I stood in my kitchen for the next 20 minutes, trying to convince myself it was some kind of scam. But Mercer had been too composed. He never raised his voice, never asked me for anything, never sounded uncertain. He spoke the way someone speaks when they're not worried about being wrong. I called my brother immediately. It rang through to voicemail. I called again, same result. I sent a message saying I needed him to call me as soon as possible, that someone had just contacted me about a debt connected to my property in his name. No reply came that night. I didn't sleep much. The next morning I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, which was slightly unusual for her at that hour. Before I had explained much of anything, she asked if I could come over on Saturday evening. Her voice was careful, measured in a way I didn't associate with her. She sounded like someone who had already prepared what they were going to say. Something about the way she answered told me she already knew why I was calling. When I arrived at my parents' house on Saturday, my brother was already there, sitting at the kitchen table looking at his phone. My father stood near the counter. My mother had put chairs around the table as though she'd been expecting a specific kind of conversation. My cousin Wanda was sitting off to one side, quiet. I sat down and looked directly at my brother. "Did you use my property as collateral for a loan?" He kept his eyes on his phone. "Put that down." He set it face down on the table. He didn't look at me. My father cleared his throat. "Let's talk through this together. We can figure something out as a family." I turned toward him. "Figure what out? Did he or did he not file documents involving my land?" My father looked down into his coffee cup. My mother folded her hands on the table in front of her. "He's had a hard year," she said quietly. "Sports betting got out of control. The debt kept building, and he didn't know what to do." "He didn't come to me," I said. "He used my property without telling me, without asking me, without a single conversation." "You have the land," she said. "He's your brother. That's what family means. You help each other." I stared at her. "He signed my name on legal documents. That's not asking for help. That's fraud." Nobody in that room contradicted me. Nobody offered an alternative explanation for how a power of attorney bearing my name could exist. Nobody called the lender's account of things inaccurate. That silence told me more than any admission would have. They weren't sitting around that table to explain themselves. The truth was already in the room. They had invited me there because they expected me to hear what had happened, forgive it, and quietly find a way to absorb my brother's consequences. I left with fewer answers than I had arrived with and a much clearer understanding of where I stood. On Monday morning, I drove to the Service Ontario Land Registry office in the county and asked the clerk at the front desk for certified copies of all documents filed against my property address over the previous 18 months. She typed for a moment, stepped into the back office, and returned with a folder. I sat at one of the public tables and went through everything: the mortgage documentation, the annual tax assessment records, my original purchase deed, all familiar. Then I turned a page and felt my hand go still. It was a land transfer deed, showing that I had conveyed a 50% ownership interest in the property to my brother approximately 9 weeks earlier. My name was on the signature line at the bottom. I read the document 3 times. Then I looked at the signature. It wasn't mine. I know my own handwriting. I have a specific way of forming the capital letter at the start of my name that I've used since I was a teenager. A particular angle, a particular loop, a stroke that curls in a certain direction at the end. Whatever was written on that document was close enough that someone had clearly studied an actual sample of my signature before producing it. But the loop was wrong. The final stroke went in the wrong direction. It was convincing at a glance, but I had signed thousands of documents in my adult life, and I knew my own hand better than anyone else could. I had never signed a land transfer deed. I had never appeared before a notary in connection with my brother's name or finances, not once. Attached to the transfer was a notarized declaration confirming my identity and consent. The notary's stamp looked official. It wasn't. A cold feeling moved across my shoulders and settled there. This wasn't one impulsive decision made in a desperate moment. Submitting a fraudulent land transfer in Ontario requires more than a signature. It requires supporting identification documentation, a notarized declaration, and specific forms filed correctly with the land registry system. Someone had gathered those materials. Someone had assembled this carefully enough that it passed through the recording process without being flagged. I photographed every page in that folder before I left. On the drive home, I kept thinking about my father's garage. A few years earlier, while clearing out space in my home office, I had left a small cardboard box of older files at my parents' place for what I'd intended to be temporary storage. The box contained things I didn't need regular access to but hadn't wanted to shred. Old property insurance correspondence, a signed equipment loan application from early in the Sugarbush build-out, a folder of vendor contracts from my first 2 years of syrup sales, various forms with my signature, and personal information. I hadn't thought about that box in well over a year. That evening, I drove to my parents' property while I knew my father would be out on his evening walk. The side door of the garage was unlocked, as it always had been. The box was on the second shelf where I'd left it. I opened it and started sorting through the contents. Most things were where I'd placed them. But when I lifted the equipment loan folder, something felt different. There were documents inside it I hadn't put there. The first was a credit application in my name, with my social insurance number filled in at the top, applying for a business line of credit I had never requested from a lender I didn't recognize. The second was a handwritten amendment to my property insurance policy, naming my brother as a beneficiary in the event of total property loss. I had never requested that change or signed anything authorizing it. Then I found something at the very bottom of the box that made me close my eyes for a moment before I could continue. Inside a small plastic bag were 2 notary stamp seals, still in their original packaging. Attached to the outside of the bag was a printed order receipt. The purchase date was 11 weeks earlier. The order was placed under a numbered company registration I had never seen before. I stood in that garage for a long minute without moving. This wasn't one forged signature. This was a system. Someone had gone through my stored documents and found samples of my actual handwriting, my SIN, my insurance policy details, and signed contracts showing how I formatted my name on legal forms. They had used that information to build a paper trail, a credit application, a fraudulent insurance amendment, and a land transfer supported by counterfeit notary certification. Every piece had been assembled in sequence. The box I had left at my father's house for safekeeping had given someone everything they needed. I photographed every document before replacing it all exactly as I had found it. Then I drove home. That evening a dog down the road started barking, and a few minutes later I noticed a dark SUV parked at the end of my lane. A man in a gray jacket climbed out and walked slowly toward the property line, looking in the direction of my evaporator shed and the guest house. I went outside. "Can I help you?" I called from the porch steps. He glanced over without urgency. "Just getting a sense of the layout. I'm doing a valuation for a client." "What client?" "Mercer Financial. We have a registered interest in assets at this address." My stomach dropped. "You're on private property without permission," I said. "I need you to leave now." He shrugged, as if I'd made a mildly inconvenient request. "I'll be done in a few minutes." "You'll leave right now." I held up my phone. "I'm recording this. If you haven't turned around in the next 30 seconds, I'm calling the OPP." That moved him. He walked back to the SUV at a deliberate pace, like someone making a point of not being hurried. Before he got in, he turned and said, almost casually, "You'd be wise to have a conversation with your brother soon. He's made some commitments that are going to be difficult to undo." He drove away. I stood on the porch for a long time after that, looking out at the property in the dark, the evaporator shed, the guest house, the path into the sugar bush. Every structure on that land had been paid for entirely from my own earnings. Every repair, every upgrade, every unexpected cost, my accounts, my decisions, my effort. My brother hadn't contributed a single weekend of labor, hadn't helped cover a single bill, hadn't been there in the spring of 2022 when a late frost threatened the entire maple season, and I had driven through the bush alone at mid, with a headlamp checking temperature sensors. He had offered all of it to a lender without once speaking to me. The next morning I was partway through my routine at the evaporator shed when I heard gravel shifting in the lane. I came around the side of the building and saw 2 vehicles pulling up, my brother's truck and my parents' sedan, with my cousin Wanda in the back seat. Nobody had called ahead. My brother was already talking before he had finished closing his door. "You spoke to Mercer's people, didn't you? You're turning this into something it doesn't need to be." I waited. "I was $68,000 in the hole and I didn't have options," he said. "You have equity here. You have assets. You could end this with one signature." My father stepped forward. "Nobody's here for a fight. Let's just work through this calmly." My mother's voice came from behind him. If you cooperate with the lender's process, this goes away quietly. You don't have to make an enemy of your own brother over a piece of land. I looked at each of them in turn. He forged my signature on a land transfer deed, I said. My voice was very quiet. I wasn't angry in the way I might have expected to be. I passed angry, somewhere much calmer and much more certain. He purchased counterfeit notary stamps and used documents I stored at Dad's house and filed fraudulent paperwork with the land registry office under my name. That is fraud. That is forgery. Those are criminal offenses under the Criminal Code of Canada. My brother opened his mouth. Don't, I said. No one spoke. I reached into my jacket pocket, took out my phone, and dialed the Ontario Provincial Police non-emergency number. My brother watched me do it. My mother said something I didn't fully catch. My father turned his face away and looked somewhere toward the tree line. The dispatcher answered, and I spoke clearly and steadily. I reported a fraudulent land transfer deed filed against my property at the Haliburton County Land Registry Office, a forged power of attorney, a private lender's representative conducting an unauthorized inspection of my land, and the evidence I had gathered relating to the source of the fraudulent documentation. I gave my address and said I would have materials ready for the responding officers. When I hung up, my mother looked at me as though I had done something she would never forgive. You didn't have to do this, she said. Yes, I said, I did. 2 OPP officers arrived approximately 20 minutes later. My family was still on the property. The officers asked everyone to remain calm and began taking statements from each of us separately. I handed over the folder I had put together over the previous days, printed copies of the fraudulent land registry documents, the original purchase deed showing sole ownership, photographs taken in my father's garage, and the video recording of the Mercer financial representative standing in my lane. One officer worked through the folder page by page while the other took notes. My mother tried once more. This is a family matter, she said. We can deal with this ourselves without involving outside parties. The officer looked at her without any particular expression and said that a fraudulent land transfer registration was not a family matter. It was fraud under Section 380 of the Criminal Code and forgery under Section 366. For the first time that morning, nobody had an answer. The officers collected the evidence, confirmed that a formal investigation would be opened, and explained that the Land Registry Office would be contacted as part of the process. Before they left, they explained what would happen next and what I should document in the meantime. I watched the patrol vehicles back down my lane and disappear onto the road. Then I went inside and made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table with my hands around the mug. Through the window I could see the edge of the sugar bush. The maples were beginning to turn, orange and gold moving up the ridge in patches, the way they do every October in that part of Ontario. That land was still mine. 8 months have passed since that morning. The investigation moved faster than I expected, once the evidence was in the hands of people equipped to act on it. Within 6 weeks, the fraudulent land transfer was formally voided at the Land Registry Office, after investigators confirmed that the notary stamps were counterfeit and that the signature on the deed did not match my identification records. My property title was restored to its original state, cleared of every fraudulent claim. My brother was charged with fraud over $5,000, forgery of a document, and identity fraud connected to the use of my social insurance number on the unauthorized credit application found in our father's garage. The criminal proceedings are still working through the court system, but the charges are serious and he is navigating them without anyone managing the situation on his behalf. For the first time in his adult life, there is no one between him and his own consequences. Preston Mercer's firm was referred to the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario as part of a broader investigation into unlicensed private lending operations across the province. I was not the only person they had done this to. Several of us eventually provided statements to investigators, and hearing the other accounts made me understand just how important it had been not to stay quiet and try to handle things internally. Silence would have protected no one, except the people who had done wrong. My relationship with my father is different now. We speak occasionally. There is a careful distance between us that was not there before, and I think both of us understand that some of what was damaged may not recover completely. What happened in his garage did not happen without his knowledge. Those documents did not access themselves. My mother and I have not spoken since the morning the officers came to the property. She made a choice that day, and I made one too. The sugar bush had its best season last spring since I bought the property. I tapped 714 trees, produced more syrup than I had in any previous year, and sold out entirely at the first farmers market weekend in April. The guest house was fully booked through the summer months. I had a new gate installed at the lane entrance with a lock that I control, and I filed a fraud alert flag with the land registry to ensure that any future document submissions connected to my title would trigger an automatic review before being processed. Some people have told me that cutting contact with my mother was too severe, that I should have found a way to maintain the relationship despite what happened. I understand why people say that. I also understand something that took me a long time to learn, that protecting what you have earned is not cruelty. It is not selfishness. It is not a failure of love. I spent 8 years making choices that no one else in my family made alongside me. Every early morning, every shift I volunteered for, every trip I didn't take, and every dinner I left early to save money. I did all of that because I wanted to build something truly mine. When the people who should have been proud of that instead decided it was theirs to use, they made a choice. I had to make one too. My name is the only name on that deed. After everything that happened, it finally means exactly what it always should have.